students, let's talk about the causes of the French Revolution, how it got started. We'll end this lecture with essentially an overview video of the French Revolution. And then you'll get into more details throughout the week about the different stages of the French Revolution, mostly focusing on the Reign of Terror, and then the rise of Napoleon will be next week. So just to overview for you, there are four main stages of the French Revolution that in retrospect we've created as historians. The first one would be considered the moderate phase. This is when you have something called the Estates General to start with. They get together, they meet, there's a disagreement. The Third Estate leaves the Estates General and they create the National Assembly, and the National Assembly votes to create a lot of very positive things like a constitution and a Bill of Rights for the people. But you have to understand, at this point, Louis XVI is still the king, and he still has a lot of power, and he is going to resist some of these changes. And so some people think that that is not enough, that they need to get rid of the king, that it can't just be a limited monarchy, but it needs to be, or a constitutional monarchy, but it needs to be a republic. And so stage two is the radical phase, and that's where the French people attempt to set up a republic, and they do that with fear and executions of their enemies. So they start by executing Louis XVI. Maximilien Robespierre is one of the most well-known figures of the Reign of Terror, and he's going to force the Republic on the French people, whether they want it or not. A reaction against Robespierre is that there's a third stage, it's called the conservative stage, and Robespierre is executed, and then they set up a more moderate republic with less violence, and they establish a directory where they still have their governing body, or their what we call a national convention at this point. But they have what's called a directory, where they have 5 people that are in charge of the National Convention. So it kind of gives this idea of having some leadership instead of having chaos, like in the radical phase, but not having one person be too strong, because they didn't want another Louis XVI. This doesn't seem to work, and eventually you're going to have one of the directory members that consolidates his power, and that's the fourth stage, where you have Napoleon come and take charge. So that's the overview of the French Revolution. Now we're going to get into the causes. So the first thing that you kind of need to understand, our essential question, is what causes people to revolt against an established government? What makes people so upset that they actually resort to violence and they attempt to overthrow their government? Well, let's take you through some of the basics right here that were going on in France and see how all of these things came together to have enough to overthrow the government. So we already know that France is an absolutist monarchy. We have learned from Louis XIV, the Sun King, that the king really felt like they were there because of divine right, and so they had a lot of power over people's lives. With the Enlightenment ideas spreading, this is going to be frustrating, but in 1789 in France, one of the things that happens that makes people start to become a little more upset with their king is that the Bourbon family, which is what Louis XVI is from, as you can see here, is going to marry Marie Antoinette of the Habsburg family in Austria. That alliance is an important alliance because historically France and Austria have been at odds and have fought against each other. So them coming together is considered a political international move to create and strengthen both of their empires. The problem is that Marie Antoinette, by most of French people, is hated because she represents the enemy. And even though Louis XVI marries her, he actually is not liked well enough to be able to make up for the fact that he just married a person people don't like. So that's kind of, there's that going on, but that's not enough to start a revolution. There needs to be more. And lucky for France, they had a lot more. So the first thing we're going to talk about are the political and social inequalities that existed in France. France had what's called the estate system. An estate system is just a way by which the French people broke up the social classes in their society. And so they called it the old regime. And in the old regime, the first estate would have been the clergy. And they had the highest level and most respect because they were the church. And these are all the church officials. Some of them are very rich, some of them are very poor, but the point was that they had some privileges that no one else had. They had under 1% of the population of all of France, but they owned 10% of the land in France, and they paid no taxes. They also are going to hate a lot of these Enlightenment ideas that question the authority of the church and religion and call into question a lot of their privileges that the estate system had granted them. So the second estate are the nobility. The nobility are oftentimes given positions of power by the king within the government. They have titles. They may be officers in the military. They may be in charge of the government and the courts. They may be local magistrates that would be officials who would just decide any kind of disagreement between people. They would come and investigate murders, all of that kind of stuff. But the nobility was granted that privilege. They're less than 2% of the population, but they're going to own 20% of land and they're going to pay no taxes. And they also disagreed with the Enlightenment ideas because it lessened their power and their privileges. Now, the third estate is a huge group. And it is everybody else. So we've talked about 3% of the population so far. We've talked about the clergy, 1%, the second estate, 2%, and now we get to the third estate, and the average, most people say, is 97% of the population fell into this third estate category. And they could have in this category some very wealthy people. Oftentimes, they might have been more wealthy than the nobility or even some of the upper level clergy because they were involved in trade and they were merchants, and that was where the big money was starting to be. But even with that, you had these people have very few economic and social privileges and no political standing, like no voice really in government. So let me take you through some of the people that were in it. The upper level third estate members, they called them the bourgeoisie, and this would have been considered the middle class. They're the educated professionals, the shopkeepers, the bankers. Some are very wealthy, like I said. They're going to pay really high taxes. They like to dress like nobles, wearing wigs, waistcoats, and culottes, but they strongly believed in the Enlightenment ideas because these ideas were going to grant them more power, more access, because everybody should be able to participate in government. So this is something that the bourgeoisie really liked, was the Enlightenment ideas, and they were a lot of times the ones responsible for spreading them around in books and salons and coffee houses. The third estate also included the lower classes. These would be workers in the cities, sometimes butchers, brewers, weavers, cooks. They were less educated than the bourgeoisie. They had to be very frugal and thrifty and work hard. Within this group are some more radical people. We call them the sans-culottes because they didn't wear culottes. They didn't wear the short pants that were associated with nobility or the bourgeoisie who were trying to act like nobility, but they wore longer pants because, they're workers and they wanted to wear something that was actually comfortable and worked for their jobs. They often went hungry when famine occurred. Their diet consisted of about 3 pounds of bread per day, but very little else, sometimes vegetables. Meat was considered something for the rich. So they lived pretty tough lives, and they paid a lot in taxes. And then you have the more rural third estate members, the peasant farmers. This is the largest group of the third estate, about 80% of the population. They're very faithful to the Catholic Church. They don't really love Enlightenment ideas, but they do get frustrated because half of their income goes to taxes. They're often going to go hungry. They're still required to perform free work for the government for a set number of days or for nobility. And even though they lived very difficult lives because the land was so rich and France was such a wealthy nation, they lived actually better than most peasants in the rest of Europe. So here's our summary. You have the first estate, the second estate, and third estate. And this system, this old regime, is going to really give you a sense of why the people of France were ready for a revolution. They did not like their king, they did not like their queen, and they do not like this system that makes the third estate, which is the majority of the population, pay all the taxes without really a voice in government. So the third estate is going to start to wake up to the injustices that they are experiencing and start to question their role and their situation in life, but they don't start to question it until the Enlightenment ideas begin to spread. Because until then, they kind of assumed that was what they were born into and that was their lot in life. But once you get the Enlightenment ideas spreading, the third estate is going to have not just question the system, but believe that there is a better way. So we know that the Enlightenment ideas, like Montesquieu with the separation of powers, and Locke with life, liberty, and property, and Rousseau with the idea of a social contract, were all spreading, and that these ideas challenged the idea of an absolute monarchy and the system of the old regime. Additionally, the French are going to help the American colonists in the American Revolution in the late 1700s. And the result of that is they see and help another country gain the freedoms that they themselves do not have. Another reason the American Revolution is a cause, not just the Enlightenment ideas, is because the French went over there and fought against the British, helping the colonists, but it put the French economy in debt. So they had a huge debt as a result of that war and a previous war, the French and Indian War. But again, debt by itself wasn't enough. The Enlightenment ideas by themselves aren't enough. The three estate systems by itself is not enough. But put all of these things together and you have a situation where people may be beginning to think revolution is their only option. And like I showed you before, with the map at the beginning, weak leadership coupled with all of these other things that are frustrating the French people and making them angry is really what's going to probably be the tipping point. Because you've had this system and some of these things occurring for a really long time, since Louis XIV and even before. So why now? Why in 1789? And a lot of people think it has a lot to do with how poor of a leader Louis XVI was. He was indecisive. He put off dealing with the economic problems. He had actually attempted to raise taxes on the nobility, but was not able to find the power to do that. And so he just had a lot of problems. He was a very young king when he took over, and he had married a queen that no one liked. So this queen that no one liked, Marie Antoinette, her nickname was Madame Deficit because she spent tons of money. She was really focused on court culture and parties. The French people hated her, one of the reasons initially being because she did not produce an heir. She was dedicated to absolute monarchy principles, and she was also very young. They were teenagers when they started to rule France. So this type of weak leadership with all of the other problems that were going on in France made the French Revolution probably inevitable. As I mentioned before, with some of the economic problems as a result of war, the government in France is going to essentially become bankrupt. Louis XVI has raised taxes on the third estate, increasing their cost of living. A loaf of bread gets to a point where it's 1 month's earnings to buy it, and we already know that that is the main diet of the French people. So by 1788, France was almost bankrupt. 50% of the government's income went to pay interest on their debt, so they couldn't even pay off any of the principal. All they were paying was on the interest of the money they owed. 13% of the economy of France went to support the royal family and their lifestyle. So the results are you're going to start to see riots in the street. A lot of times they called them specifically bread riots because they were rioting over the price of bread. So in 1788, Louis is forced to hire this guy by the name of Jacques Necker. He believed in Enlightenment ideals. He believed that this tax system needed to change. This guy is our finance guy for France. And he starts to tell Louis XVI he needs to reduce the court spending. He needs to reform the government. He needs to get rid of some of these tariffs and improve trade. And he proposed taxing the first and second estates. The results, King tried to tax the first and second estates. The results, the first and second estates said, no, we're not going to do this. Why don't you call the Estates General, which is the governing body of France? It had not been called in 175 years. Call the Estates General, which would be representatives from the first, second, and third estate. We'll all get together and we'll decide by voting, because the first and second estate did not want to do what Necker and the king wanted. So the summary statement that you're going to need to think about is the Third Estate revolted against the king, Louis XVI, or you could say the French government, because, and you need to think of why they revolted. What were their reasons? So now we're going to watch the Crash Course French Revolution video that's going to take you kind of through the basics of the French Revolution so you have a real good foundation.
Hi, my name is John Green. This is Crash Course World History, and today we're going to talk about the French Revolution. Admittedly, this wasn't the French flag until 1794, but we just felt like he looked good in stripes. As does this guy, huh? So while the American Revolution is considered a pretty good thing, the French Revolution is often seen as a bloody, anarchic mess. And Mr. Green, I bet like always it's way more complicated than that. Actually, no, it was pretty terrible. Also, like a lot of revolutions, in the end, it exchanged an authoritarian regime for an authoritarian regime. But even if the revolution was a mess, its ideas changed human history far more, I will argue, than the American Revolution. Right, so France in the 18th century was a rich and populous country, but it had a systemic problem collecting taxes because of the way its society was structured. They had a system with kings and nobles we now call the Ancien Régime. Thank you, 3 years of high school French. And for most French people, it sucked because the people with the money, the nobles and the clergy, never paid taxes. So by 1789, France was deeply in debt thanks to their funding the American Revolution. Thank you, France. We will get you back in World Wars I and II. And King Louis XVI was spending half of his national budget to service the federal debt. Louis tried to reform this system under various finance ministers, even called for democracy on a local level, but all attempts to fix it failed, and soon France basically declared bankruptcy. This nicely coincided with hailstorms that ruined a year's harvest, thereby raising food prices and causing widespread hunger, which really made the people of France angry because they love to eat. Meanwhile, the king certainly did not look broke, as evidenced by his well-fed physique and fancy footwear. He and his wife Marie Antoinette also got to live in the very nice palace at Versailles thanks to God's mandate, but Enlightenment thinkers like Kant were challenging the whole idea of religion, writing things like, "The main point of enlightenment is of man's release from his self-caused immaturity, primarily in matters of religion." So basically, the peasants were hungry, the intellectuals were beginning to wonder whether God could or should save the king, and the nobility were dithering about, eating foie gras and songbirds, failing to make meaningful financial reform. In response to the crisis, Louis XVI called a meeting of the Estates General, the closest thing that France had to a national parliament, which hadn't met since 1614. The Estates General was like a super parliament made up of representatives from the First Estate, the nobles, the Second Estate, the clergy, and the Third Estate, everyone else. The Third Estate showed up with about 600 representatives. The First and Second Estates both had about 300, and after several votes, everything was deadlocked, and then the Third Estate was like, you know what, forget you guys. We're gonna leave, and we're gonna become our own National Assembly. This did not please King Louis XVI, so when the new National Assembly left the room for a break, he locked the doors, and he was like, sorry guys, you can't go in there, and if you can't assemble, how are you gonna be a National Assembly? Shockingly, the Third Estate representatives were able to find a different room in France, this time an indoor tennis court where they swore the famous tennis court oath, and they agreed not to give up until a French constitution was established. So then Louis XVI responded by sending troops to Paris, primarily to quell uprisings over food shortages, but the revolutionaries saw this as a provocation. So they responded by seizing the Bastille prison on July 14th, which coincidentally is also Bastille Day. The Bastille was stormed ostensibly to free prisoners, although there were only 7 in jail at the time, but mostly to get guns. But the really radical move in the National Assembly came on August 4th, when they abolished most of the Ancien Régime. Feudal rights, tithes, privileges for nobles, unequal taxation, they were all abolished in the name of writing a new constitution. And then on August 26th, the National Assembly proclaimed the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen, which laid out a system of rights that applied to every person and made those rights integral to the new constitution. That's quite different from the American Bill of Rights, which was like begrudgingly tacked on at the end and only applied to non-slaves. The Doromac, as I called it in high school, declared that everyone had the right to liberty, property, and security, rights that the French Revolution would do an exceptionally poor job of protecting. But as noted last week, the same could be argued for many other supposedly more successful revolutions. Okay, let's go to the thought bubble. Meanwhile, back at Versailles, Louis XVI was still King of France, and it was looking like France might be a constitutional monarchy, which might have meant that the royal family could hang on to their awesome house. But then, in October of 1789, a rumor started that Marie Antoinette was hoarding grain somewhere inside the palace, and in what became known as the Women's March, a bunch of armed peasant women stormed the palace and demanded that Louis and Marie Antoinette move from Versailles to Paris. which they did because everyone is afraid of armed peasant women. And this is a nice reminder that to many people at the time, the French Revolution was not primarily about fancy Enlightenment ideas. It was mostly about lack of food and a political system that made economic contractions hardest on the poor. Now, a good argument can be made that this first phase of the revolution wasn't all that revolutionary. The National Assembly wanted to create a constitutional monarchy, they believed that the king was necessary for a functioning state, and they were mainly concerned that the voters and office holders be men of property. Only the most radical wing, the Jacobins, called for the creation of a republic. But things were about to get much more revolutionary, and also worse for France. First, the Jacobins had a huge petition drive that got a bit unruly, which led troops controlled not by the king, but by the National Assembly to fire on the crowd, killing 50 people. And that meant that the National Assembly, which had been the revolutionary voice of the people, had killed people in an attempt to rein in revolutionary fervor. You see this a lot throughout history during revolutions. What looked like radical hope and change suddenly becomes the man as increasingly radical ideas are embraced. Thanks, Thought Bubble. Meanwhile, France's monarchical neighbors were getting a little nervous about all this republic business, especially Leopold II, who in addition to being the not holy, not Roman, and not imperial Holy Roman Emperor, was Marie Antoinette's brother. I should note, by the way, that at this point the Holy Roman Empire was basically just Austria. Also, like a lot of monarchs, Leopold II liked the idea of monarchies, and he wanted to keep his job as a person who gets to stand around wearing a dress pointing at nothing, owning winged lion monkeys made out of gold. And who can blame him? So he and King William Frederick II of Prussia together issued the Declaration of Pillnitz, which promised to restore the French monarchy. At this point, Louis and the National Assembly developed a plan. Let's invade Austria. The idea was to plunder Austria's wealth and maybe steal some Austrian grain to shore up French food supplies and also, spread revolutionary zeal. But what actually happened is that Prussia joined Austria in fighting the French. And then Louis encouraged the Prussians, which made him look like an enemy of the revolution, which of course he was. And as a result, the assembly voted to suspend the monarchy, have new elections in which everyone could vote, as long as they were men, and create a new republican constitution. Soon, this convention decided to have a trial for Louis XVI, who was found guilty and by one vote sentenced to die via guillotine, which made it difficult for Austria and Prussia to restore him to the throne. Oh, it's time for the open letter? An open letter to the guillotine. But first, let's see what's in the secret compartment today. Oh, there's nothing. Oh my God, Stan! Gee, that's not funny! Dear Guillotine, I can think of no better example of Enlightenment thinking run amok. Dr. Joseph Guillotine, the inventor of the guillotine, envisioned it as an egalitarian way of dying. They said the guillotine was humane, and it also made no distinction between rich or poor, noble or peasant. It killed equally. You were also celebrated for taking the torture out of execution, but I will remind you, you did not take the dying out of execution. Well, unfortunately for you, France hasn't executed anyone since 1977, but you'll be happy to know that the last legal execution in France was via guillotine. Plus, you always got a future in horror movies. Best wishes, John Green. The death of Louis XVI marks the beginning of the Terror, the best known, or at least the most sensational phase of the revolution. I mean, if you can kill the king, you can kill pretty much anyone, which is what the government did under the leadership of the Committee of Public Safety, motto, "We suck at protecting public safety," led by Maximilien Robespierre. The Terror saw the guillotining of 16,000 enemies of the revolution, including Marie, I never actually said let them eat cake, Antoinette, and Maximilien Robespierre himself, who was guillotined in the month of Thermidor in the year 2. Oh right, so while France was broke and fighting like 9 wars, the Committee of Public Safety changed the measurements of time because, the traditional measurements are so irrational and religion-y. So they renamed all the months and decided that each day would have 10 hours and each hour 100 minutes. And then after the Terror, the revolution pulled back a bit and another new constitution was put into place, this one giving a lot more power to wealthy people. At this point, France was still at war with Austria and Britain, wars that France ended up winning largely thanks to a little corporal named Napoleon Bonaparte. The war was backdrop to a bunch of coups and counter-coups that I won't get into right now because they were very complicated, but the last coup that we'll talk about in 1799 established Napoleon Bonaparte as the first consul of France. And it granted him almost unlimited executive power under yet another constitution. And when he was declared first consul of France, Napoleon proclaimed, "Citizens, the revolution is established on the principles with which it began. It is over." By which he presumably meant that France's government had gone all the way from here to here. To here. As with the American Revolution, it's easy to conclude that France's revolution wasn't all that revolutionary. I mean, Napoleon was basically an emperor, and in some ways he was even more of an absolute monarch than Louis XVI had been. Gradually, the nobles came back to France, although they had mostly lost their special privileges. The Catholic Church returned too, although much weaker because it had lost land and the ability to collect tithes. And when Napoleon himself fell, France restored the monarchy, and except for a 4-year period between 1815 and 1870, France had a king who was either a Bourbon or a Bonaparte. Now, these were no longer absolute monarchs who claimed that their right to rule came from God. They were constitutional monarchs of the kind that the revolutionaries of 1789 had originally envisioned. But the fact remains that France had a king again, and a nobility, and an established religion, and it was definitely not a democracy or a republic. And perhaps this is why the French Revolution is so controversial and open to interpretation. Some argue the revolution succeeded in spreading Enlightenment ideals, even if it didn't bring democracy to France. Others argue that the real legacy of the revolution wasn't the enhancement of liberty, but of state power. Regardless, I'd argue that the French Revolution was ultimately far more revolutionary than its American counterpart. I mean, in some ways, America never had an aristocracy, but in other ways, it continued to have one. The French Enlightenment thinker Diderot felt that Americans should fear a too unequal division of wealth, resulting in a small number of opulent citizens and a multitude of citizens living in misery. And the American Revolution did nothing to change that polarization of wealth. What made the French Revolution so radical was its insistence upon the universality of its ideals. I mean, look at Article 6 of the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen. Law is the expression of the general will. Every citizen has a right to participate personally or through his representative in its foundation. It must be the same for all, whether it protects or punishes. Those are radical ideas, that laws come from citizens, not from kings or gods, and that those laws should apply to everyone equally? That's a long way from Hammurabi, and in truth, it's a long way from the slaveholding Thomas Jefferson. In the 1970s, Chinese President Zhou Enlai was asked what he thought the effects of the French Revolution had been, and he said, "It's too soon to say." And in a way, it still is. The French Revolution asked new questions about the nature of people's rights and the derivation of those rights. And we're still answering those questions and sorting through how our answers should shape society today. Must government be of the people to be for the people? Do our rights derive from nature or from God or from neither? And what are those rights? As William Faulkner said, the past is never dead, not even past. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next week.